All right, good morning, everybody. Can you go ahead and shut that door? So good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Grumbine. I have the honor of moderating this panel. Our speakers will be J.D. Ault. So you may know him from New Economic Perspectives. His presentation will be on portals to MMT. You have Steve Larchuk of Larchuk Offices. He'll be discussing money, famine, how we got in and how we get out. The next up will be David Gerlitz, Principal Equity Management Corporation. His topic will be Modern Monetary Theory, a Layman's Journey to Understanding, with thoughts on the critiques of Lavoie and Baker. And then last but not least will be UMKC's own Matt Rice, who will be presenting Money in America. So without further ado, let me hand the mic to Mr. J.D. Ault.
Thank you very much. I have to say that I see Warren sitting right here in the front row, and that makes me very comprehensive.
It's the only open seat.
Well, to begin, I have to ask the economists here to forgive the fact that I greatly oversimplify really complicated things. And this is partly because I'm an architect and unversed in the complications. But it's also because I believe that MMT requires a very simple explanation in order to access the mainstream awareness. 2 years ago, I attended the Aspen Ideas Festival. It took me a couple of days to realize that the ideas being explored were primarily about how to creatively deal with the problematic fact that market capitalism does not create money for ventures, no matter how useful to society, which do not generate monetary profits. Dollars for non-profitable undertakings must instead be begged from profits. Building on that realization, I'd like to consider if and how it might become normatively acceptable within a market capitalist system to monetize with direct sovereign spending useful not-for-profit ventures. Let's begin with a very simplified review of how and for what purpose the present Federal Reserve banking system does in fact create US dollars. A member bank of the Federal Reserve System decides to make a loan. The loan is issued and the dollar signs represented by the loan are deposited in the bank account of the borrower. These are new dollar representations that did not previously exist on the books of the American economy. The borrower then writes a check on that account to pay for goods and services. The deliverer of the services deposits the receipt check in their own bank account. At the end of the business day, in the clearing process at the Federal Reserve, the accounts of the different banks are reconciled. Bank A presents all of the checks it has received, demanding dollars from Bank B, $30 from Bank B's reserve account, and deposits it in Bank A's reserve account, etc. In aggregate, at the end of a good business day, there are always more dollar representations to be reconciled than there are actual dollars in the existing reserve accounts, reflecting the net new representations created by the loans within the banking system. How then is the reconciliation completed? In essence, the Fed simply creates the necessary new dollars to ensure the full reconciliation occurs. If that didn't happen, we'd have a banking crisis every day of the week. This has proven, obviously, to be a very effective system for the conduct of market capitalism because it ensures seamlessly that as many dollars are created as the banking system decides that American business ventures in aggregate can usefully spend. I'll come back to that last phrase, usefully spend, because it is key to the ideas I want to pursue. But first, I want to note that this system is a uniquely apolitical way of allocating new dollars into the private sector, because the allocation decisions are systematically rather than democratically implemented. The allocation decisions fall into the realm of banking procedures, referred to in general as underwriting, the process by which a particular bank decides whether or not to make a particular loan. Effective and efficient as it is, this system has some notable drawbacks. First, it reinforces the illusion that US dollars are created by the American banking system rather than by the sovereign government. The banks, in fact, initiate the process by which new dollars are created within the banking system, but it is the sovereign government which actually creates them, a reality which is unfortunately made invisible by the process. This misunderstanding, in turn, reinforces the illusion that the sovereign government must collect tax dollars in order to have dollars needed for federal spending. Crippling as these misperceptions are, however, the largest downside has to do with that phrase, usefully spend. As just noted, the underwriting norms of the banks are what determine whether or not a given loan will be usefully spent. And those norms implicitly define useful in terms of whether or not the dollars loaned will generate a monetary profit. I.e., will the borrower be able to repay more dollars than he or she borrowed? It doesn't matter what purpose the loan dollars are to pursue. It doesn't matter if achieving that purpose will result in something useful to a local community or to collective society. The only criterion for a successful bank loan request is whether or not the loan dollars will generate the required monetary profit. In essence, then, the Federal Reserve banking system is at present specifically structured only to create new dollars for the purpose of monetizing profits in a market economy. In itself, there is nothing evil or unfair about this. But the downside is this. The Federal Reserve banking system is unable to create new dollars for the purpose of accomplishing things which we as a collective society are in dire need to have accomplished, but which, alas, the accomplishing of does not generate monetary profits. Dollars for those kinds of tasks and undertakings must come from either taxes or deficit federal spending or charitable contributions, all of which are subject to severe political and or budgetary constraints. Given this perspective, especially in view of the dire challenges we are now currently facing on such fronts as climate change, health care, and failing infrastructure, one could reasonably argue that it is high time we tweak the procedures of the Federal Reserve to enable it to also directly create new dollars for worthy not-for-profit ventures that will benefit local communities and collective society. These arguments for direct sovereign spending are easy to make because there are so many beneficial but monetarily unprofitable. Things that can be undertaken and accomplished right now by the American people. And paying American workers new dollars to accomplish these useful things would be no more inflationary than creating new dollars through the banking system for the purpose of monetizing financial profits. Pursuing this sensible goal, however, runs immediately into two fundamental challenges. The first challenge is the misperception, already alluded to, that banks create our money, and therefore the federal government has to tax or borrow dollars from the private sector in order to have them to spend. In other words, direct sovereign spending is not a legitimate option that is even available to our democratic process. Assuming this misperception could be corrected, a second and perhaps even larger challenge arises, what I would call the MMT Allocation Problem. This is the problem of who will decide and by what process will the decision be made, how new dollars for direct sovereign spending should be allocated. As we've already discussed, new dollars for profit-making ventures are allocated in a decentralized and systematic fashion. And this process takes place so automatically and seamlessly, most people are not even aware it's happening. But imagine, if you will, the federal government deciding it wanted to directly create and spend $100 billion new dollars to pay U.S. citizens to undertake and accomplish useful but non-profitable things. By what reasonable and effective process could those dollars be allocated? If your imagination runs like mine, what you're visualizing right now is political chaos. So there's good reason, apparently, not to allow the idea of direct sovereign spending out of the genie bottle. We must preserve, after all, our collective sanity. Nevertheless, I'd like to briefly explore a possible strategy for doing it. I think of this idea as a portal to MMT. That is to say, not a doorway through a highly guarded normative membrane, but an invisible seam, if you will, where otherwise implacable resistance might be non-existent. So it's not so much an idea about letting the genie out of the bottle, but rather sneaking the genie inside the normative membrane, where I believe it would ultimately be quite welcomed by all. The portal I have in mind connects directly with a highly effective system already operating inside our monetary membrane, America's charitable trusts and foundations. There are reasons why this connection makes sense. First, while each foundation or trust defines its mission differently, I think it would be fair to generalize that a charitable mission is something which is highly useful to a local community or collective society, but which market capitalism, in its necessary pursuit of profits, has no interest in making happen. Our charitable foundations and trusts, in other words, are specifically set up and organized to address the downside to market capitalism we just identified, namely its inability to undertake useful ventures which do not generate monetary profits. Second, America's charitable trusts and foundations embody a sophisticated and decentralized system for allocating dollars. Charitable trusts and foundations, in other words, are systematically set up to perform the same function for direct sovereign spending as the underwriting process does for the Federal Reserve banking system. That is to say, they could provide an initial solution to to the MMT allocation problem. In a nutshell then, the idea I'm suggesting is this. If we could figure out a normative way to insert new dollars created by the Federal Reserve into America's system of charitable trusts and foundations, the existing allocation procedures of those institutions would take care of the rest. The trusts and foundations could expand existing undertakings and begin wholly new ones. After a few years, when it became generally understood that the new dollars were not generating inflation, MMT might well become a normative part of political economics. Even if we assume, however, that an enlightened Congress passes an appropriations bill directing the U.S. Treasury, for example, to contribute matching dollars to the spending of America's charitable foundations and trusts, another problem now arises to confound us. We discover it is not possible for the U.S. Treasury to spend new dollars created by the Federal Reserve without those dollars being tallied as having been borrowed by the federal government from the private sector. Thus, while the political narrative might embrace the idea of expanding the mission of charitable trusts and foundations, it would certainly not embrace the idea of expanding at the same time what we habitually think of as our national debt. To achieve our goal, therefore, it seems some change in the Federal Reserve procedures is unavoidable. But what change might encounter the least resistance? The strategy I propose is not to change the Federal Reserve processes at all, a scary proposition, but to simply add another dimension to the definition of a charitable trust foundation. Specifically, make them banks within the Federal Reserve system. The charitable banks, like all the other banks, would have a reserve account at the Federal Reserve. Just like regular banks, just as regular banks create bank dollars when they make a loan. To keep things under control, the number of C dollars thus created could be limited by a dollar-for-dollar matching rule. For every C dollar the charitable bank creates and spends, they must spend an actual dollar from their endowment funds as well. The bank at the Reserve, along with all the other dollar representation it has received, to be reconciled. The C dollar reconciliation is accomplished as follows. The Fed deposits with a keystroke a reserve dollar in the charitable bank's reserve account. It then transfers that dollar to the reserve account of the bank which has requested the reconciliation. Dollars are thus outcomes in exactly the same systematic manner in which they are created to monetize the profits of the market economy. And as we understand, the magical thing is that the Fed can never run out of keystrokes to implement this procedure. To summarize, let's step back and see what we've accomplished. The Federal Reserve banking system and procedures remain unchanged. Congress continues to appropriate funds for national spending, and the U.S. Treasury continues to spend the dollars appropriated, either by debiting its tax accounts or issuing treasury bonds. In other words, nothing has changed to upend any apple carts or threaten any vested interests. Yet something quite extraordinary has been inserted into our social economy. Our charitable trusts and foundations are now able to double the dollars they can spend to undertake and accomplish their charitable ventures. The direct sovereign spending, which makes this possible, is the same invisible, systematic Federal Reserve procedures which monetize every day the private sector's profits. The new benefits to local communities resulting from the expanded charitable ventures do not involve and are not dependent upon congressional debate or political consensus. Finally, and perhaps most important, the new benefits to the collective good will not have required either the collecting or spending of tax dollars, nor will they result in any increase in what we call our national debt. The genie, in other words, has slipped through the portal.
That's great. Thank you.
Ready?
Do you have the clicker?
My name is Steve Larchuk, and I am the least qualified person in this room probably to be addressing this group. I'm a historian and a lawyer, but when it comes to persuading people, that's my business. I'm in the persuasion business, and I have been for 37 years. I've been a trial lawyer for 37 years. When you go to the courtroom, you don't have very much control over the jury. Obviously, we have no control over who's in Congress, or we wouldn't have the Congress we have. But it is, as they say, what it is. So imagine for the next 10 minutes that I'm talking to a jury consisting of Congress with all of its existing biases and a president. A president who is not afraid to do something unexpected. Matter of fact, loves it. Loves to do the unexpected. So, imagining that you are that jury, money famine. I would be saying to you as I'm standing here, understanding that I can't make you agree with me, but I can find a way to let you agree with me. In other words, tapping into your existing biases, your existing way of thinking, rather than me trying to hit you over the head saying, in a very ill-disguised way, boy, are you stupid. How about I don't say that? How about I say, you're really smart, you're here because you want to do the right thing, and let me show you the way things are and let you agree with me. So, we start with money famine. This group probably intellectually understands that the United States is in a money famine. We have people who are unable to live even paycheck to paycheck. They've exhausted everything they had. Couples are both working. They've maxed out their credit. If they inherited anything from the prior two generations, it's gone. If they had equity in their homes, it's by and large gone. The amount of money we're spending on supplemental nutrition assistance and on Medicaid and things like that are the difference between people literally dying and not. That's a pretty thin safety net. So when I say we're in a money famine, it's not inappropriate to use the word. Don't be afraid to call a thing what it is. It's a famine. And just like in the Middle Ages, when there were famines, food famines, you know, the nobility ate. The clergy ate. The people that supported the nobility and the clergy, the armies and the sheriffs and all those people, they ate. But the vast majority of people didn't. And that's where we are. That's where we are right now. We're in that pretty highfalutin level of society. We're eating, this group here. We're going to eat in a few minutes and listen to Warren. But if you go out and actually talk to people, if you pull up to a gas station and you just talk to the person next to you, you're going to find that there is a money famine. And when Dr. Kelton said the other day, what's the problem with the economy? It's too little consumption. Well, it's not because people don't want to consume. The problem is they don't have the wherewithal, the money to consume. And I'm not disagreeing with the people who say we need a job guarantee. I'm not sure I agree with the way they want to do it. But we're talking about bare subsistence. If you're talking about $15 an hour, that's not going to recover for these people what they lost. So let's talk a little bit about what's happened, how we got in. This is the aggregate trade deficit since 1980. And once again, I apologize. I'm not an economist. And some people say to me, oh, the deficit doesn't matter because we traded. We got a bar of steel, we got a car, we got rubber ducks in exchange for our money. And if people are stupid enough to give us real things in exchange for paper money or digital money, we should let them do it all day long. And my response is, a lot of that money went for oil, which was consumed within 3 months. A lot of that money was for toys, which maybe lasted until January 10th, after Christmas. Some of that money maybe was in hard objects like cars. Do any of you still drive a car from 1975 to 1980, 1985? A lot of that money went into electronics. Do you have any electronics that you bought 5 years ago? Essentially, this money left our system. It left our economy, what I call the working economy. We might as well have burned it, literally burned it. And so when you look at the trend, you can see that it sort of follows a lot of other lines that you see, and it's 14 trillion. If you want to adjust it for inflation, it's 18 trillion. So imagine that's 18 trillion that has left our system. Now, when you're trying to persuade people, it's helpful to use metaphors. The metaphor that works here is if we had a patient on the table and they were bleeding, you'd do two things. You'd stop the bleeding and you would give them a transfusion. Well, we're bleeding, folks. We're bleeding big time, and that's just one way we're bleeding. Here's the other way. The yellow line on top is a reflection of the wealth transferred to the 1%. And as you can see, it's about equal to the hemorrhaging from trade deficits. And when people say to me, oh, well, that money still exists, or God forbid, these are the job creators, I wish that were true. When people say, well, all that money that's overseas, it'll come back to us, they'll buy our stuff. I wish that were true. If it were true, we'd be a lot better off, but it's not true in either case. These are two wounds on our patients sitting on the operating table. We're hemorrhaging. We've been hemorrhaging since 1980, and that when you combine it, it's just these two wounds to our working economy, it ends up being about $37 trillion. 37 trillion. So if I'm addressing a group that probably hasn't thought about it that way, I say, we haven't replaced that money. Not only are we not stopping the bleeding, we haven't replaced the money. We haven't done the transfusion. What we need to do, if we don't have the political courage to actually stop the bleeding, to do something about the trade deficit, to do something about the wealthy consuming more and more, or what I say, hoarding more and more. And when I get ordinary people, not this distinguished group, when I present these thoughts to regular people, I say, the fact that the wealthy have the money doesn't mean it's doing any good. If I go and buy all the groceries from the local grocery store, and I put them in my garage, the groceries still exist, but they're not doing what groceries are supposed to do. They're not out there feeding people. And that's what we have. We have this hoarding. So let's assume that the audience, my jury, says, okay, interesting. Almost $40 trillion. When I say, the entire economy is only about 17 trillion GDP, that's as if we've hemorrhaged out 2.5 years worth of GDP over the last 40. And my response at that point is, what did you think would happen? If you kept bleeding, if you bled out $40 trillion over the last 40 years, what did you think was going to happen? What's going to happen is exactly what we have. So, how does this help with MMT? If I've got the jury thinking, okay, we have a problem, not just a little problem, we've got a huge problem, I would suggest that we need to start a transfusion. If we can't stop the bleeding, then we have to start transfusing at a rate that not only matches the hemorrhaging, but makes up for lost ground. So this gray area is a reflection that if we invested $2.5 trillion a year for the next 10 years, we wouldn't even be halfway to where we need to be. But we would have at least started. The dotted line on the right is a reflection of the net, because we're going to continue to hemorrhage. We're going to continue to hemorrhage money in trade deficit. We're going to continue to hemorrhage money spinning up to the 1% where it's hoarded. So call that $1 trillion a year, which is as good a number as any. So if we do $2.5 trillion a year, then we're going to make up $1.5 trillion. Now imagine that you're in Congress and you've got $2.5 trillion burning a hole in your pocket. Imagine you're Donald Trump and you've just been told, we can put $2.5 trillion a year into the economy. What do you want to spend it on? Instead of wringing hands over whether we can do a little bit of this or a little bit of that, which is what we're doing now, and not agreeing on what that should be, if instead the question is you've got $2.5 trillion that you must spend, how are you going to spend it?
We'll spend it on a wall.
Well, let them spend it on a wall. Why fight over that? Because if you say, okay, I'll give you the wall, I want job guarantee. You can spend on the wall, but I want health care. You can spend it on a wall, but I want the ports to be fixed and the dams and the locks to be fixed, and I want school buildings to be repaired. $2.5 trillion over 10 years is a lot of money. And here's where Donald Trump comes in. Obviously, I didn't vote for the man, but he's there. And so what can we use in his personality to our advantage? What I would say if he were sitting right there is, Mr. President, you don't have to go to Congress and arm wrestle with them over this. Stupid as the idea sounded in 2012, you have the ability to mint a platinum coin, $25 trillion platinum coin. Just tell the Secretary of the Treasury to do it. Tell him to walk it across the street, down the street to the Fed, and deposit it to the account of the United States of America. Make sure you get a receipt. And he can say, the president can go to Congress and say, I've taken away the hard decision. I've already done it. There's $25 trillion sitting in the Treasury. I don't have the power to spend it under the Constitution. I can pay part of the accumulated debt. I can do that. But by and large, it's up to you, Congress. But I've done the hard part. The $25 trillion is in our account. Spend it. And that's a much easier debate. So how does this help us as advocates? This is just one way to frame it, pitch it, brand it, whatever you want to call it. But think how much easier this just got. Instead of me having to drag Warren to every meeting so that he can explain the economics of all this, I just say, look, I'm not asking you to create new money. I'm asking you to replace the money that has left our system. I'm not asking you to create new blood. I'm asking you to replace the blood that has hemorrhaged out of the patient for the last 40 years. I'm not asking you to arm wrestle over who do we have to steal from in order to get something over here. I'm not asking you to pick winners and losers. I'm asking you to figure out how we restore the health of the middle class and the economy. Isn't that a lot simpler? I think it is. Thank you.
And Warren's going to take.
No, it's not a question, but we've already spent the money in deficit spending. It's 20 trillion plus private sector, so that's already happened. That's where their money came from.
Okay. I'm not Warren Bozer. Okay.
You're not.
And I love you, by the way, I met Warren in St. Croix, and I got private economic lessons from him for many days, so I'm a very lucky person. Who cares? Okay? I mean, literally, what you just said, who cares? Why make it more complicated?
Now it's less complicated.
Well, one of the advantages of not being an economist is I can look at it from a regular person's point of view.
Okay.
Now, if I could pitch that the way I just did, that we're actually $40 trillion in the hole, which we haven't replaced, all I'm asking you to do is replace it. That's not a hard sell. I could sell that all day long, especially to a guy like Donald Trump. Thank you.
Next up, David Gerlitz.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciate it. I know there's a couple other really cool panels going on right now, so you can just feel free to get up and go. You made it to Sunday final session. So I'm here, because I'm inspired by this stuff. I'm inspired by Warren. MMT organizes the structures of society in a way that's coherent for me. I think that resonates with a lot of people and allows me to kind of make sense of the world. And so even one-to-one, it's kind of a revolution of the mind, I think. And I'm inspired by trying to bring additional people in on a one-to-one level. So I want to talk a little bit about my story. I'm in real estate in Colorado. My first contact with MMT was actually about 20 years ago. I was just out of college. I was kind of a know-it-all progressive, but I had steadfastly avoided any kind of economics in college for fear of being brainwashed. And one time I was at like a cocktail party or a dinner party or something, and you make small talk in those kinds of situations. I was across the table from a guy, and I said, "So, as you would ask, what do you do?" And he said, "I'm an economist." And I'm not very good at hiding my emotions on my face, right? So he kind of picked up on my skepticism, and he said, "No, we do things differently." Really? I don't think so. Right? And he said, "Okay, well, tell you what, why don't you ask me one question? Ask me whatever you want to know about economics." And proving that I might have known a little bit, and I said, "How is it that the government can run out of money?" And he said, "Well, that's really just it. It can't." And then, proving that I really didn't know much at all, I said, "Okay, well then, how do we pay back all that debt?" And he said, "Well, that's the other thing. The debt's not supposed to be paid back." I don't know if that made sense or not, but it made me think. And so I said, "Hey, where can I learn about this stuff?" And he said, "Well, there's this one guy in Australia." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "No, there's a couple people in Kansas City too." And I said, "Well, let me get this straight. It's one guy in Australia and all the other economists in the world." And he said, "Yeah, that's about it. And that's when I knew this guy was onto something. So, he wanted me to go to Australia and study on this guy, but I kind of had other ideas. I was courting my girlfriend at the time. Colorado sounded like a really nice place to live. So that's what happened. And immediately upon leaving that place, economics, right? Some other stuff that night, like how when you take government out of the equation under the hood, that bank credit and government money are really actually different things and not the same thing. Some of it made sense to me, some of it didn't. Flash forward 10 years, young entrepreneur, I've got a family, and 2007, 2008 come around, right? And all of a sudden, I can't do any business. I can't sell any real estate. I can't buy any real estate. And so I figure it's time to find that guy in Australia. And tell me why 4,000 miles away I can't do any business. So I go to the bookstore, and I'm thinking a little bit of history. If any of you are familiar with it, there's not much history in that book. And it's all about fiscal meltdowns and how government debt is bad. So I go to the blogs, and I find something called Zero Hedge. Right? Now this is really funny stuff. This is amusing. This is making me laugh. Right? But again, it's all about how government debt is bad, and it's not really clicking with what I'm trying to find out. I tried reading Keynes, and it didn't go well. I tried all these kind of various sources, you know, the Motley Fool and Seeking Alpha, and I'll say there's actually some pretty good stuff on Seeking Alpha, but if you don't have a way to, you can't do anything with it. So one day I was on a site called Naked Capitalism, and I wish you were here. The proprietor of that site was here this weekend. She's not here today. And she had a link to an Australian economist, right? By the name of Steve King. And he had this article called The Roving Cavaliers of Credit. And I thought I was home. This was my introduction to endogenous money. And, you know, it was a great education, but I pretty quickly found out that this wasn't exactly what I was looking for either. So I kept at it, kept at the blogs, and I'm on another blog, and I read a comment by somebody that says the US government is a currency issuer and not a user. And this starts to click, right? And it has a link to a book by a guy named Randy Ray called Understanding Modern Money. I picked that up. And I started to finally get this stuff. So I'm almost there after reading Randy's book, but I didn't quite get it completely. I was reading Ellen Brown at the same time, and so I had this more kind of positive money type understanding in my brain, right? Where I thought that if they just simply stopped issuing treasuries, that everything would be okay. They could just spend. And I was thinking a lot about the Federal Reserve at the time, and this, yeah, always a bad thing, right? The MMT concept of consolidation of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. And by this time, I found Bill Mitchell's blog, and one day, and I'm reading, and he's writing about consolidation, and it says that in this way, we can conceive of Treasury issuance as a monetary and not a fiscal operation. And it was like the Rubik's Cube clicked into place in my brain, right? It was like all of a sudden, all these structures of society just kind of became clear and made sense. So that brings me to kind of one of the main points that I wanted to make, just quickly. Mark Lavoie has a critique of MMT, where he says, modern monetary theory must get rid of its counterproductive statements and convoluted logic based on the fictitious consolidation of government and the central bank. You know, if you go back to the first question that I asked the MMT guy, which was, how can the government run out of money? There's an implicit kind of understanding within that the central bank and the treasury are conjoined, right? And so I think that one of the ways to continue getting this message out, a lot of kind of right-wing libertarians separate the central bank out, and the world generally has this understanding of the central bank separated out as being something separate and other from the government. And so I think pushing the narrative that there is consolidation and that the Federal Reserve is federal and part of the government, which they will tell you themselves if you ask their employees that they're part of the government, is one way to kind of push an understanding forward of MMT. It's kind of like, there's this old joke in a Danny DeVito movie where he says, well, everybody needs money. That's why they call it money, right? And it's, you kind of have to think about it for a while. But I think it's kind of similar. It's like, and that's why they call it the Federal Reserve, because it's federal. So, you know, how else can we talk to people and get this message out? One of the things we were talking about in one of the panels yesterday is that the number one reason people have deep beliefs is because it's been repeated to them so many times. The number one reason that people have deep beliefs is because it's been repeated to them so many times. Okay? So we need to be repetitive and insistent about modern monetary theory. But one of the things that goes along with that is actually never saying the words modern monetary theory. You know, if you don't like your brother-in-law and you want to kill him, go ahead, say modern monetary theory to him, right? He's gonna go unconscious and his eyes are gonna go into the back of his head. Steve made that exact point at the last session. And as an aside, if you weren't at that session on MMT grassroots organizing, please go watch the videos for that because it's phenomenal. But, you know, what I say to people actually is that I'm a supporter of using functional finance to raise the floor. Not raising taxes, but raise the floor. I think raising the floor is a tremendous kind of soundbite and talking point, again, for getting some of these concepts through. And you can go on and at the same time, you know, functional finance is alliterative, and you can contrast it with kind of the dominant paradigm of sound money, and it's a simpler concept to explain to people. It also kind of protects the creators of the theory from my bad language. Another one that I like to use on the question of affordability is that it pays for itself. If you want economic growth, it pays for itself. If you want full employment, it pays for itself. I think this is a nice way of kind of artfully and elegantly moving the conversation in the direction that you want it to go. You can move it to financial aspects and talk about it that way. You can move the conversation to social aspects and talk about it that way. And it really kind of avoids the question of how much and where is it going. Other things that you can put out on social media would be things like federal finances are not like a household. If we can put that out there 30 million times, if you go out and put that out on social media later today, and then you do it again next week, and then you do it again the week after that, eventually other people are gonna pick up on it, and they're gonna say the same. Getting a little bit more complicated, but government deficits create private savings. Simple statement. If you want kind of creator approval, and I picked something out from Bill Mitchell's speech yesterday. He said the government is our agent, or the government is supposed to be our agent. That's another great phrase that I picked directly out of Bill's speech yesterday that we can use. So, anyway, I think Stephanie Kelton said yesterday that it's time for this movement to move forward. I don't think we need to wait for their approval on exactly everything that we're going to say. I think it's time to start putting it out there and pushing it. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next up,
What's that, Greg?
I'm sorry?
You know
next
who
up
was
will
it
be
called?
No, it wasn't.
Steal your thunder all weekend long, and it's a constant, augmented process that I've undergone for the last few days. I want to start with my name, Matt Rice. I go to the University of Missouri, Kansas City here, of course, and this is an institutional economics school, and so what was once one of the dominant forms of economics in America has all but largely disappeared. UT, Tennessee, Oklahoma were all institutional schools, as well as others. They've all gone to the neoclassical side. So being here, we definitely get a side of economics that most people aren't getting anymore. With that being said, money is a social institution. Obviously, the creation of money is by two ways: the credit creation process and then by spending by the government. But behind that, the value in this money comes both from the legal framework with which we create through social processes, as well as and coming from that, the idea was to look into the history of money in America. Money and banking usually go hand in hand. And while I don't want to get in too deeply into the weeds and bore all of you on this Sunday morning, I do want to hit some of the highlights. And it begins with Vag Foster's Frontier. We arrive in North America, in the Americas, specifically North America. We have our colonies. On the fringes of these colonies, you have people that are trading in furs. In Virginia, they use tobacco receipts as the currency. Metallic exchange. As the European powers gain more and more power in America, we do go towards that. We have bimetallism. But we're still on the fringes of the system because we're at a crossroads here. We have the Caribbean, we have Canada, and so many people are moving through here that we're not using just pounds and shillings and all of those things. In fact, the Spanish pieces of 8 is reputed to be the dominant form of currency in America before the Revolutionary War. That's not an English metal. You have, like I said, bimetallism, so you have both a silver and a gold standard, but one of those, once it's paid, automatically becomes undervalued. So you have a Gresham's law that's pushing gold and silver into dominant positions, going back and forth. So there's always been this argument that we had some stable system. It didn't exist prior to the Revolutionary War, and it certainly didn't exist after the Revolutionary War. But we come to the Revolutionary War, and we go off of this bimetallic standard. We go into the issuance of notes and papers by the Continental Congress, which, of course, comes up with the all too famous expression, "not worth a continental." And it was this excessive printing of money, and they essentially became worthless. Soldiers, would even attempt to refuse to accept them. And so there's this narrative that gets created that the printing of money, as well as the government itself, cannot be trusted to maintain the value of the currency with which it issues. So after the Revolutionary War, you have the first North American Bank is established. For a time, it has a limited charter. Afterwards, you have the Jacksonians that come in and completely do away with that system. followed by the Civil War, which again, you have the greenbacks issue. And we all know the inflationary story of the greenbacks. Again, buttressing that argument that the government, when it issues notes and stands behind them, especially in a time of war, there's mass inflation. Over the rest of the 19th century, you have the argument for a more stabilized system. In 1863, during the Civil War, you have the National Banking Act, which is passed, which allows the chartering of private banks, but they are the ones that are allowed to issue a national currency. It's in 1863 that we finally implement a national currency instead of some sort of gold standard or temporary issuing of notes by private banks who are given monopolies over this issuing. We established a system where the federal government oversees it. And as the 19th century progresses, this is a stabilizing force, of course, but there are times of, boom and bust, like we've seen through much of American history. So in 1930, the Federal Reserve Act is passed. Of course, the rural people in this part of the country feel as though it's just a giveaway to the New York banks, further complicating the efforts to centralize what had begun in the Civil War. A true centralization of power in this country, which for those people that didn't want to be infringed upon by our government. We have the crash of 1929, where it's viewed as though the Federal Reserve does not do their job. And you can very well argue that they did not do their job. The New Deal comes along and government does gain the faith of many of the people in this country. It does provide jobs. It does do these other things that the federal government had never provided in this century. And then, of course, we're finally dragged out of this by World War II. What's different between World War II and the Revolutionary War and the Civil War? This time we don't fight it in our own territory. It's fought overseas. So our productive capabilities aren't really infringed upon. In fact, we ramp them up. And through massive government spending, we produce anything and everything that we might need in addition to many of our allies throughout the world. We come out more powerful than any nation perhaps in the history of the world. And thanks to the Lysenko affair, where Russia could have been, they are not. And it leaves us all by ourselves. Through the 1950s and the 1960s, we are a hegemonic, productive power. It eliminates this argument that wars lead to great inflation and destroy the monetary base of a country. Yet we still cling to this frontier mentality that we do not need a strong central government. And it is from this study of our past that I believe one can make the argument that MMT is in a unique position. As I said to begin with, money is a social institution built around social processes. It is important, hugely important, that we understand that MMT, to take that step further that so many people have been talking about this weekend, to understand that this is a social movement. Yes, this might be the corner of economics, and fortunately, there's been a lot of lawyers here, and they're arguing, for a lot of the same things from the legal stand. But in the end, it is a social movement, and perhaps a whirl of social movement in touch with them, whether it's Black Lives Matter, which is, there's some people would call them Antifa. I think there's probably a number of different movements around that. But they're all coming out of the free speech movement of Berkeley in the 1970s. Out to them, I believe that we can move forward more collectively, more powerfully. We were at dinner last night. Somebody joked. Somebody got up and it wasn't a toast per se, but it was to make the observation that there were about 15 guys in a table in a room at McCoy's, and the observation, of course, was implicit there was no women there. And
there.
Were you there when you did the actual?
When the toast?
Yeah. Okay. So, but he makes a good observation. Economics. And yes, there have been some women around, but surely not enough. There needs to be other disciplines brought in. This can't be an economics exclusive movement, group, society, whatever you want to refer to it as. But furthermore than that, there are things going on in this country and, that are connected to this country that cannot be denied, and it can't be just an economic issue. I wake up yesterday morning and the New York Times is reporting that Puerto Rico is going to be without power for 4 to 6 months. Our 51st state is going to be without power for 4 to 6 months. If New York had lost all of their power, do you think anybody would say it'd be 4 to 6 months? Absolutely not. We have 1,900 military personnel reportedly down in Puerto Rico right now. That's not acceptable. Our entire military should be mobilized and heading down to not only Puerto Rico, but the entire Caribbean. This is, not only an economic fact, these are societal choices that we are making. And I absolutely believe that MMT needs to be in the middle of these arguments. We cannot just be arguing the economics any longer. We must be arguing that these are social imperatives. Thank you.
Very good. I want to thank all of our panelists. We're going to go ahead and open it for questions. So let's go ahead and just start taking them. We'll do 3 and then we'll go ahead and let the panelists answer.
Hi, this is for.
You're not.
Okay. This is for the regarding the MMT portal discussion. So you use the word charitable to describe the MMT bank, and I take objection to that word because I think we need a paradigm shift in how we think in this country, that anything the government does should not be just treated as a handout or as charity, but as a general public good, because that's the duty of the government. So that's just one comment. And just a follow-up question is, when we talk about non-profit ventures, a lot of these would involve probably some private charities or foundations. And the problem with that is that they often have their own agenda. A lot of them are run by religious groups, and there is room for discrimination of various sorts. And even you could have some mandates, but there is some inherent bias. So would it not be better to, and this would probably require congressional approval and be harder, but both ways are hard, but have government agencies that are funded at the federal level, but set up at the state and local level so that there is more democratic control, that people have a direct say, and that they cannot discriminate in any way or form, and don't have any political agenda that can be completely neutral. So that's my question. Thank you.
I sympathize with what this gentleman said, and have alluded earlier in the conference that there is available already a means for doing what the first gentleman said, and that is to make MMT relevant to socially beneficial enterprises, and that device is public banking. And that is under democratic control, as municipalities and school boards and county governments and even state governments undertake to establish banks that can, first of all, develop infrastructure, but also fund economic development enterprises rather than giving tax incentives, give low interest loans to developers, and make the interest somehow correspond to the degree of difficulty that the contractor or developer has to abide by in development, so that you get almost a free loan if you undertake certain aspects of your development venture, and the more freedom that you want, so to speak, to do as you will, then the higher interest you pay. So, but in any event, I've also gotten the impression from the last gentleman who spoke that, perhaps it was the gentleman who spoke earlier before him, that MMT is perhaps by default interested in a strong central government, and perhaps that's the reason that the gentleman on the panel last night suggested he was in favor of government grants rather than public banking. Public banking is more localized, is subject to elections of local officials, and so it looks to me like it would be a very good way of implementing exactly what you're saying.
Thank you. This gentleman right here, and then that gentleman, and then we'll go ahead and let the panelists answer.
Hi, JD. I'm on the board of a wonderful charity in Florida, and in fact, I think you don't need all these things. Just a job guarantee does it. At least my charity, most of the money is spent on salaries, and we're always looking to hire more people. If job guarantee actually provided that to us, we'd be done. There'd be no matching 1-to-1, which is an arbitrary match. There'd be no political choices. It's just the person wants to come and work for us, and we just don't have the money to pay for it. So I think we've already got a mechanism there if you get job guarantee. And is it David?
Yes.
What took you? 20 years you meet Warren. And you obviously like the long road, right?
I do like the long road.
All right, last question, then we'll let the panelists go ahead and answer.
I think my question is related, it's more technical though, and I'm not sure, maybe Matt on the panel could answer it, but if, whether we do a job guarantee or we have grants from the federal government that go to public banks that you locally spend, or grants that are from the money from the Fed that goes to charity, to some kind of trust kind of thing. In any of, we're basically talking about not worrying about the deficit that is caused by that, the budget, in the most broadest sense, the federal government deficit. What is my technical question is, what is the MMT position on whether that deficit, when the years when we have one, needs to be funded by the Treasury issuing bonds, or can it be funded by the central bank as part of the government simply creating the money and crediting it to the Treasury's account without selling bonds to the public? So if somebody could answer that for me, I would appreciate it.
Okay, panelists.
Warren,
Warren, would you like to talk?
Would you like to answer
that?
Who would like to take the first crack?
Well, I think the first question was addressed to me, so I will try to respond. And I think that I totally agree with everything that you said, and also with the idea that the public banking structure might well be a better way to go than what I'm talking about here. I think, to clarify, what I was trying to, and I may not have done a very good job of it, but what I was trying to focus on was the idea that suddenly hit me very like a ton of bricks when I was at the Aspen Festival, and that is that we have this banking system, this monetary system, that seamlessly creates money without any question in a systematic and non-apolitical way, automatically creates money for profit-making ventures. Okay, and the idea is that's great, but the problem is it excludes, it inherently excludes an enormous number of undertakings that are desperately needed. And those undertakings struggle, and they do it very creatively, but they struggle to access funding to undertake what they're doing. And so it just was striking to me, why do we have why do we structure our economic, our monetary system in such a way that it can only do that one thing, and it can't do the other thing? And so I was trying to imagine a way, trying to visualize a way to fix that. I was trying to visualize a way to insert into the existing monetary system a mechanism whereby that system could produce the goods and services on both sides of the equation. So that's where I was coming from, and I certainly didn't mean to to get into the implications of charity, giving people charity and everything, because I've always thought, my position has always been, from an MMT perspective, is that what we're doing is we are paying ourselves to do work to solve problems that we need solved. And it's not like somebody's giving us money, where we are getting paid to do things, to do real things. And I'm always trying to focus on real things. And what intrigued me was when you try to think of those things, then there's a big argument about which things should do. And I was intrigued by the fact at this conference in Aspen that here are all these incredible organizations who spend all their time identifying and putting together programs to do a lot of the things that we need to do. And if they had additional funding, they could talk, they could expand those efforts in region. So that's, there you go.
All right. I wanted to answer your question, but first I wanted to go to the funding question. Some gentleman back there, I don't see it. Oh, there you are. Securities don't fund the government. We spend, and then we sell securities for interest rate maintenance. They're sold so that you can regulate the reserves in the system, so that the Fed can hit its short-term interest rate target. Okay. So what was the?
Clarify that. Assuming that the federal government spends in a certain year, because of these wonderful things that we're doing, spends more than it taxes, would you always make up the shortfall by having the Treasury issue bonds, or would you only do that? Really, we're talking about alpha learner and functional thing.
Yeah, sure.
Do it in order to regulate the interest rate. Would you have some of that not funded, which is kind of what JD is saying, that some of it is not, some of it is just money created.
So,
and the government gives the bank a thank you note for the money, but it doesn't, nobody issues new debt, and the national debt does not rise.
So the answer is, if the government spends money and doesn't tax, that's fine, it's a credit to bank accounts. But if that's all you do, that's called a zero interest rate policy, because reserves in the system that don't pay interest, the market will, through market forces, that will drive the policy rate to zero. If you don't want the policy rate to be zero, the government has to pay interest on that money.
Okay.
So what I've been proposing for a very long time is that we have a permanent zero rate policy, so we can do exactly that. Japan's had a zero rate policy for 30 years or something, so they pay no interest on their deficit spending. They just leave those reserves. And so we had a very low interest rate policy, so we paid reserves we have related to the policy, the interest rate choice. To get to where you want to be, you have to agree that a zero rate policy is there. If you want a higher rate policy, like a 5% rate policy, then you've got to pay 5% on the money, whether you do it by paying interest on reserves or selling securities. Securities are just different accounts of the Fed, it doesn't matter. So that's all about interest rate policy and not about, does that explain it to you?
Does that lead to a pile of excess reserves in the system after paying zero? Not in bonds, does that lead to a pile of excess reserves in the banking system?
Yeah, well, that's all you have anyway, except whether they're in reserve accounts or securities accounts. We have 20 trillion in different pile of 20 trillion in the Fed. Net financial assets of the economy. They're either in reserve accounts, securities accounts, or actual cash. And the mix is controlled by various factors. So they're somewhere. The public debt are the dollars spent by the government that have not yet been used to pay taxes.
and you asked whether MMT is staking its position on big government. And again, is that essentially what your question was, or private
No,
banking?
I don't, it seemed to me that maybe folks here at least on last night's panel, are kind of dismissive of public banking. And I think this gentleman said he much preferred grants. And certainly the government's creation of money is a centralized task. And so I was just drawing an inference and was trying to advocate for more lower level democratization of the creation of money, or participation in the creation of money. Because I thought you described the process very well. You make a loan, city makes a loan to itself, creates a mortgage, or it buys bonds and then pays interest on the bonds, or it creates a mortgage that it pays back itself. It charges itself nominal interest. That interest gets paid to the municipality. They can use that interest for public purposes, buy up their own bonds, use the interest they're paying for a public purpose, rather than continuing to fuel the financialization of our system.
It doesn't work that way. It would be nice, but it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, and I think there's probably different camps and different degrees of what people, whether people are in favor of private banking or not. But as we've seen, if we try to cut the banks out entirely, they'll just attempt to create their own money. And I don't necessarily mean that they'll just start printing their own bills, but they'll figure out ways to make loans without permission from the government. So very much, you'll read sometimes in the literature the central bank takes defensive positions, and it's an acknowledgement that the central bank has to work within whatever the banks would like to do on their own. You can't legally regulate them, of course.
Oh, that's not true.
You have to. There's a collaboration that goes on there.
I'm not saying there isn't, but it's not true that the banks can do what you said.
They can. There's securities and things that they can make. So that they hire rocket scientists essentially to make these things that we don't even really understand.
Yeah, I was one of them. I know
Okay.
how it works.
I should believe him then.
I'm not going to argue with Warren.
Well played.
I know Warren well enough that I'm willing to argue. Let me just say that after 3 days of this, which has just been well spent, I go 5 years and repeat it and try and find something that works. You better come up, whether you want to adopt my suggestion or something else. We're going to be doing this 25 years from now, and maybe have 400 people instead of 200 people, unless we find language that the average person can relate to, because then the average person elected to Congress can do the same. You've got to find a way. So every time I hear the conversation go into, well, do we have to issue bonds? Is there an offsetting this or offsetting that? And I'm sorry, I just think to myself, the double entry bookkeeping system was invented for merchants. And we keep saying over and over again, that's not what the government is. The government isn't your corner store. It's not your family budget. It's a whole different animal. So why do we insist on thinking in terms of the corner store and balanced budgets and ledgers when that's not what we're talking about? So simplify it. Somehow, some way, we have to come up with a simple message.
Okay, a couple of technicals. Just because what I want is when you go out to be able to be bulletproof out there and not get shot down by somebody on a technical error. I'm not trying to do it for any other reason, because I've been promoting it for 25, trying to promote this for 25 years. Okay, so loans create deposits, bank deposits. There is no reserve creation associated with that. You don't need it. Okay, but everything you say is correct, and certainly I agree with talking about from that. What you're talking about is public infrastructure for public purpose can include more than just the military and the police. It can include all these other things, and it does. It includes public health and education. These are all part of that, and that should be on the choices for appropriation, whether it's directly through grants or through some kind of decentralized local thing. That's all already legitimate functions of government. Anything that's not profitable, we've got the private sector funding the profitable stuff. Everything else is, you can tell people, is legitimate territory for government. Government's for public infrastructure, for public purposes. Those things are just as important as roads and bridges and everything.
But let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
This is something that I'm confused about this issue.
Sure.
And that is, it's true that we create money the federal government creates money.
Well, the loans create deposits in the bank.
It spends money. Let me
Spends
say,
money.
it spends money to build public infrastructure and to build airports and all that. But on the books, that goes down. That either has to come out of taxes or it has to come out of deficit spending.
No, it's accounted for as a deficit. It doesn't come out of it. It's accounted for.
Well,
That's
okay,
a record.
all right.
You got to keep a record of it
it's
somehow.
It's accounted that way.
Yeah, you got to keep a record of it.
All right, so
we call it the deficit,
Okay.
and that has horrible connotations.
Okay.
I completely agree.
Bad word.
I've tried to rename it, it didn't work.
Let's try it.
Well, I got
But we have to account for what we do.
No, I
And it's a
understand.
record keeping.
I understand.
Yeah.
But the profits that are generated in the market economy,
Yes.
they are not included in the deficit. So for ourselves, why is that tallied up as something in everybody's mind is that it's a cost to government?
Yeah.
Whereas all these other things that are undertaking that make profits, they are tallied up as being
Outside of government.
Yeah,
They're outside. Of course, the government wants to know because they want to tax it.
right.
But Yeah, but still.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and so, okay, so, okay, now when it comes to bank lending, don't forget Congress determines what a bank can lend. A bank has to be a member of the Federal Reserve, which is controlled entirely by the Federal Reserve Act. And they tell banks what to lend and what not to lend. So this whole thing is a creation of government. Banks are government agencies. Okay, government can go into a bank, they do, they regulate it. If they don't like the management, they can replace it. If they don't think they have enough capital, they can close you down. And they control every asset you're allowed to do or not allowed to do. The whole failure of banking that people go to is what it is, but it's ultimately a failure of government. The regulators were in there watching all those loans saying, yeah, that's fine. Now, maybe that's part of some other feedback process of political contribution. I'm not arguing that, but I'm just saying we have a massive failure of government, which now, in terms of public banks, we have public banks. Like the Federal Reserve is a public bank. A lot of people who like public banks don't like the public banks we have. They don't like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and Fed and the World Bank and the IMF. And Europe they were all public banks. Paribas, public French banks, and they had. And I'm not against public banks per se, but they had massive problems where the loans become politicized. If you're part of the political party charge, you're more likely to get the loan, the lower interest rate. Without the profit motive, the motives change. So banks are dangerous animals, whether they're public or private. We know what private banks do. Don't be thinking that public banks don't have their extreme risks. And so what happens in a public bank, if you make loans like you're talking about that aren't going to be paid back, I'm not against it, but for accounting purposes, that reduces the bank's capital. If it's a public bank, that becomes part of the federal deficit. So you've done a good thing. You promoted public purpose, but you haven't let that genie out of the bottle the way you might have thought under close examination. So, I'm just saying that because I don't want to go through all this work without having considered that. The whole point is to be able to, look, I'm 100% in favor of larger deficit spending to get these things done. And if there was a way to do it, like you said, that's why I was listening very closely, I would jump all over it, but then I saw at the end, it doesn't actually do it, unfortunately, technically. Now, I was on Fox News, Business News, 2010 or something. Stuart Varney is interviewing me. And I was on, there was supposed to be Paul Krugman or somebody, but he didn't come on, so they wanted somebody who was in favor of larger deficits. So I came on. He said, so you're in favor of larger deficits? And I said, yes. And I said, my first proposal, in fact, is a full payroll tax holiday. We do eliminate FICA taxes. It's $1 trillion tax cut. It's the most regressive, punishing tax we have, and it takes away money from people who can afford it the least, from the bottom up. And right now, we've got a banking crisis. The only difference between a good loan and a bad loan is a good loan, the guy makes his payment, a bad loan, he can't. This adds $650 a month to every working person's paycheck so they can make the payments. He goes, oh, so you're one of those big spending liberals. I just proposed a $1 trillion tax cut. I'm one of those big spending, big government liberals. Yeah, so we're up against that. No matter what I said, I was so far to the right of the Tea Party on that, so far to the right of anything. And the guy with him says, well, Stuart, he just proposed a tax cut. I go, oh.
What do you think about the platinum coin? The whole idea.
Okay, so the platinum coin started on my blog with one of the guys here who's called Beowulf on the blog. And it works technically.
Yeah.
But my idea, it's like a gimmick to try and trick people into deficit spending because you're still spending more than you're taxing. I'm not against it, but when you start doing that, it's like running away from the police when you're not guilty. You get shot sometimes. But it did turn out to popularize the whole idea of deficit spending and point out this thing, and it went a long way, and it's still there in the literature. It appealed to, people's dumb thinking. Yeah.
We need to, that is one way, but we need, hopefully, if it can be done, find a way to deficit spend without raising the national debt.
Yeah.
Because people are scared to death of this thing that's called the national debt.
Yeah.
And so whatever we can do to fund government and do wonderful things and all, and raise the economy without raising the national debt, in a way, that's what JD is all about, and frankly, that's what I'm all about. There's a lot of ideas out there.
Yeah, there's that, and then at the same time, to diffuse this notion that the national debt is anything more than the dollars spent that has been used to pay taxes, which is, it's moving in that direction, by the way.
Yes,
You know?
with respect,
Yeah.
you know, the public bank you mentioned, the Federal Reserve, bailed out its partners, the big banks, and they did not bail out my community
Okay.
or build a
All right, so
football. They
let me
did
just say
not
something.
build streets.
Let's define bailout, okay? All the major, the shareholders lost all their money. So if you have a grocery store that goes bankrupt, you know, the owner loses all his money. It gets sold and somebody else takes over or does something else with it, but you don't bulldoze the building. Okay. In capitalism in the US, the shareholders losing all their money is not a case of getting bailed out. That's a case of losing and going out of business. And so all those shareholders lost, they went out of business, new owners took over. Liquidity management is not bank bailouts. Okay, capital injection, whatever, if they had bailed out the shareholders, yes. Okay. They preserved management, maybe they should have fired them. I'm not gonna argue with that.
Put them in jail.
Put them in jail. You know, look, I'm gonna make Bill Black my attorney general. So, but, so I don't disagree with you, but they did not bail out the owners. The owners lost everything.
I just have one quick thing.
We've
And
got
just
4
one-
minutes, so everybody
Including the
knows.
Saudi prince.
4 minutes.
Just one thing is what I think I've realized listening to here is there's so many people here trying to find alternative methods of getting the government to do what it's supposed to be doing.
Yes.
And I wonder if some of these methods that we look at, like public banking, things like that, is because we still fear government doing what they're supposed to be doing, so they constantly want to decentralize it. And I'm worried that that's not really the way to do their job properly, and for people, us, the powerless, to become powerful by understanding that we can request they do that because they have the capacity. So I'd rather see a Medicare for all because I want it centralized. I want everybody to get equal things. And when we think we're not getting a voice because we're not using our voices. This is my opinion. I'm wondering if that's why we're looking for all these alternative methods.
Well, look, we're overcoming an enormous obstacle. Everybody in the population, except the people in this room, believe the deficit is too large and has to be brought down. The debt is part of the problem, rather than part of the answer. You know, we're doing the best we can to turn it over now. I've been fighting the academic debate as well. When I was in Italy for 2 months at Bergamo and Trento, these guys on there just left. They had me do 45 presentations in 60 days at universities all around Italy on panels with their leading professors, and you know, there's no, after a little bit of back and forth, a little bit of pushback, suddenly there's no dispute on any of this. And so we've done that. I've been all over the US. I've been doing the same thing. I've been visiting the Federal Reserve doing the same thing. I've met with Janet Yellen. I've met with Ben Bernanke. And not for debate, there are only 3 or 4 of us in the room, but yeah.
I was just curious. I'm not an economist. I came here. I came to MMT through Real Progressives, and I'm curious about the MMT folks that run the departments in the colleges and people like yourself.
Yeah.
Why haven't you, or are you, connecting with the political science groups and or helping to draft legislation that you can hand to the people? We will preach to the people.
Well, yeah, part of the problem is we all have full-time jobs.
Right. So, I mean, MMT out, right?
That's the thing, and then that's one of the things that they preach here at UMKC, interdisciplinarity. But I can honestly say there's probably not enough of it going on. You're absolutely right. So,
Real quickly, we are at noon. It is lunchtime. You've got something you've got to do here in a moment, sir.
Oh, yeah.
So with that, thank you very much for your time. You guys are wonderful. Thank you, Warren, for helping us.